Hey, Dave here for Zilog and Moto, and we're getting oh so close to closing out the first season of Zilog and Moto. More likely than not, we're looking at having two, maybe three more reviews before the end of the year, and then the first annual big end of the year review, where I look back on all the games I've looked at this year, give out some awards, and then maybe, just maybe, give a preview of some of the games we're going to look at in season two. Technically, the 1 year anniversary of Moto won't come until mid February, but I did some thinking about it, and it just made the most sense to cut off season 1 a little bit early and force the seasons to align with calendar years. I was really only planning on 50 videos a year anyway, and we're going to be very close to that by that last episode. So I think that's a fair cutoff. Now, all that's out of the way, let's start talking about this week's game. And it's another game that I just recently picked up and added to the collection at the Let's Go Retro Expo. But this time, it's one for the Genesis. And that game is Micro Machines. Micro Machines is a top-down racing game that's based on a series of toy cars that first hit the market in the late 80s and stuck around in various forms for 20 years, with short-lived revivals since then. If you're not familiar with Micro Machines, you're probably more familiar with either Hot Wheels or Matchbox cars instead. What set Micro Machines apart from those brands of toys wasn't the types of cars or the material they were made out of, it was the size, hence the emphasis in the name on micro. A more traditional toy car will be about a 1/64th scale, measuring about 2.5 to 3 inches long. However, Glue tried to go even smaller with Micro Machines, usually being less than an inch long. While the toys don't have a specific scale ratio, they are apparently similar to the model train N scale size. Creating smaller cars allowed for two things: packing more toys inside of a package, and creating playsets designed specifically for the smaller toys that the larger Hot Wheels and Matchbox cars weren't compatible with. And while Hot Wheels won the eventual war and continues on to this day as kind of the de facto king of toy cars, Micro Machines, at least during the first 10 years of their existence prior to Glue being taken over by Hasbro, managed to find significant shelf space right along all the other toy car brands. Micro Machines' popularity made the property ripe for video game licensing, and in 1991, Galoob licensed the rights to make a video game based on the toys with their Canadian partner Camerica for the NES. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because they're the company behind the Game Genie and other weirdly shaped, sometimes unlicensed cartridges. Camerica used European-based developer Codemasters to create Micro Machines, the game, and then Codemasters took over the developing and producing of the game when it came to porting it to the Genesis 2 years later. And to be clear, that's what this game is, an enhanced port of the NES Micro Machines title, similar to how Championship Pro-Am, that I looked at in episode 19, was a port of RC Pro-Am from the NES. If you remember from that video, I wasn't exactly the biggest fan of Championship Pro-Am, and if you don't remember, well, go watch it. So having said that, would the same fate befall Micro Machines, as it ends up being a lackluster release years too late to be relevant? Or did Codemasters, in full control of the release, come up with something truly special? Well, let's take a look. Okay, here's Micro Machines, and just to illustrate how this is a port of the NES version and a very similar game, it basically has the same art on the cover as the NES version. I don't have an NES version to compare it to, but trust me, other than some very minor edits, it's the same. I mean, if you don't believe me, go look it up on Google or something. It's the same cover. You can definitely tell that Codemasters was a solidly European-based company at the time, because the first quote you see on the cover is from Mean Machines, which is a UK-based magazine that didn't have a US counterpart that I'm aware of. And then there's also a bright Dayglow sticker here advertising that this was a #1 bestseller in the United Kingdom. And then also, this is a smaller detail, but if you notice how there's basically cover art all at the top, but then a thin bit at the bottom that has sort of the standard old style black cross hatching. That's more of the format that the Mega Drive titles had in the United Kingdom. So they sort of basically use the format that they pretty much um,
this cover is going to be identical to the European Mega Drive cover, except for having Sega Genesis system here, and this will say Mega Drive. But other than that, it's exactly the same as what the Mega Drive cover would look like. Uh, One kind of fun note here is, like I did mention that this is a sticker, and it stands out, and it is not on the outside of the case. It is on the inside, on the inner cover directly, and it's covering up where it says on the cover, basically just #1 bestseller, and not specifying that it's #1 bestseller in the United Kingdom. I'm sure basically the American lawyers saw that and were like, okay, no, you got to change that. That's false advertising. So, of course, because it was after they went to press, they just threw a sticker on it. Uh, Flipping the box over the back, there's even more quotes from UK-based magazines about the game. Specifically, there's 2 up here in the top corners, and then there's another 6 down here. The UK was definitely not lacking in video game magazines in the early 90s. It seems like every single one of them had something to say about this game. But then also, as I always like to point out, and I can't get too close to the camera here, but there are 9 screenshots on the back here, each showing like different levels or segments from the game. And they're good quality screenshots too. So, honestly, this cover, front and back, is a really good quality cover. I mean, whoever Codemasters had doing their graphic layout on this, they did a really good job. I've definitely seen a lot worse doing this channel. The case itself is in good shape. I mean, there are a few marks, like here there's a couple puncture marks there, and here there's a particularly, nasty little divot there. But other than that, the case is in good shape. There is a little chunk taken out of this corner, evidently this got dropped at some point. But the hang tab is intact. And one thing I like to point out, if you look closely, this is more of a glossy clamshell. So you can tell this is not the standard Genesis clamshell, as you'll see definitely in a moment. But these glossier plastics, these were mainly used on UK titles. I don't know why that was, if it's different in supplier, if it was easier or cheaper to get this type of plastic, but that's more common on the UK titles, like we saw it previously on EA Hockey. Now, as we open the case, you'll see that this is definitely not a generic case, because, well, look at the cartridge here. The cartridge has got this weird rounded shape to it, but label's in good shape. Cartridge looks good, and the case itself has a nice rounded mold for it to fit into, with Codemasters up here at the top, so you can definitely tell they made their own cases here. And then a little bit more inlay artwork there. Now here is the manual, and you can immediately see, as if you've seen any of the other videos previously, this is the UK style manual in that it is in landscape format rather than portrait, and that is because as we open it up, you will see 8 different languages. Now, previously on other games we've looked at, there's only been 6. There hasn't been 8, so this is a new thing here. The languages here, we've got English, German, French, Spanish, and Italian, and along with that, to get to 8, there is also Swedish, Dutch, and Finnish, and I did actually check that online and made sure those were the right languages. Cramming that many languages into a manual would normally be an issue, but ultimately the Micro Machines is a relatively simple game, and they managed to explain the game and all of its game modes thoroughly in the given space. As you can kind of see here, basically you'll get the same description for each of the 8 languages, just going across in different columns. But even with that, there is still room for some art. Occasionally, there's some of the characters from the game. So this is actually a really pretty well written manual. The game isn't very deep, but they were able to explain everything very well and do it in 8 different languages, which is pretty impressive. So the cartridge was goofy and pretty unique, but how does it play? Well, we'll get to that right now.
Micro Machines is a racing game. Now, I know, that was pretty obvious. There's not really any other type of game this could be. Specifically, however, Micro Machines is an arcade-styled, multiplayer optional racing game with a top-down view. It's somewhat comparable to Super Off-Road or Championship Pro-Am in regards to having a view of the cars and track from a high angle away from the cars, rather than a racing game with a more common, either in cockpit view or from above and slightly behind the vehicle, with instead a view of the track instead. I call this configuration arcade-styled because of the effect of the positioning of the camera has on the controls of the game. Rather than steering the car left and right by pressing left and right on the D-pad, instead you rotate your car left or right due to the overhead camera. It takes a bit of getting used to, especially if you're used to modern racing games, which almost all have done away with the top-down or isometric views, and instead use the more traditional rear chase view. Also, the throttle doesn't have much nuance either, and most of the time you either have the hammer down on the B button, or you're coasting around the course in an effort to navigate obstacles, make turns, and most importantly, stay on the actual track and not fall off during elevated courses. There's technically a brake with the A button, but you're much better off simply memorizing the courses and learning where to let off the gas, because going too slow against tougher opponents will knock you out of contention very quickly. That leads into my next subject, which is the overall difficulty of the game. There's no options screen, so there's no choosing what difficulty level you play on. But the game does have variable difficulty. How, you ask? Well, whether you're playing in head-to-head mode or challenge mode, when you start out the game, you get to choose from one of 11 different characters. The characters have different racing attributes, and they're presented on a bar, left or right, each with a name, a cartoon animation, and a word describing their driving style. The characters to the left are stronger than the characters to the right, well, until the loop of characters connects between the worst character and the best character, but you get the idea. So, pretty simply, for an easier time, choose a better driver, and for a more difficult experience, choose a weaker one. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really give you what the different characters' abilities are, so it's impossible to determine just how much better one character is than another, or in what areas, so you're just going to have to kind of guess and make the best of it. After picking a character in your opponent, or opponents as the case may be, it's time to get down to business. When you compete in a race, you would utilize one of 8 different types of Micro Machine vehicles that correlate to real-life sets of toys. Races are based around speedboats, helicopters, tanks, sports cars, Formula 1 cars, road warriors, think like the movie, turbo wheels, aka off-road buggies, and 4x4 trucks. And each car type has its own style of track background that they raced on. For instance, Formula 1 races will take place on a pool table, and off-road buggies will take place in the backyard sandbox. There are also bonus monster truck races that are available in challenge mode after winning 3 races in a row, but these are time trials and not competitive races against other players. The game does a good job of trying to replicate the virtual feel of kids playing with their toys in the surrounding environments. The game has 2 main modes, the aforementioned challenge mode and a one-on-one mode. The challenge mode should probably be considered the main focus of the game, so I'll discuss it first. In challenge mode, your goal is to make your way through 25 courses that consist of 3 races in each of the 8 environments and 8 different cars, and then a final 25th championship race. The races get harder the further you make it into the competition, as you might expect, which leads to an interesting bit of strategy that I thought about myself and then confirmed by reading the manual, as it actually spells it out for you. Remember how I mentioned that the drivers are all on a scale of good to bad?
Well, when competing in a challenge race, there are two possible outcomes. You can either finish in first or second place and move on, or finish in third or fourth, lose a life, and have to redo the race, assuming you have another life to spare. Well, those same rules apply to the computer drivers as well. I would definitely recommend some experimenting here, as choosing all the most difficult drivers to race against can make even the earlier races difficult. And with only 3 lives, unless you earn more in the Monster Truck bonus races, there isn't much room for error. That lack of room for error is probably my biggest issue with the game itself. As many racing games have, Micro Machines uses a bit of a rubber band artificial intelligence with your opponents, meaning that if you're doing poorly, the computer won't let the other drivers get too far ahead of you. But if you're driving well, the computer will drive well also, meaning that any lead you can earn can still be precipitous. I've had more than a few races in doing prep for this video where I'd be having a great race, nail the corners and traps, and wreck right before the end of the race, only to have at least the next 2 competitors, if not all 3, go zooming right by me and knock me out. It's frustrating to say the least. The rubber band AI is a bit of a necessary evil in that it keeps the races competitive. However, due to the way the game is constructed, you end up being blind to a lot of things, which is where the frustration kicks in. In my mind, it would have made a lot more sense to have included a race minimap that at least has a rudimentary layout of the course and shows where the competitors are on it. This would let you know just not only how far your opponents are back when you've got the lead, to let you know if you can take it easy or really have to push it, and of course also to let you know how far behind you are if the race hasn't gone well. Just as important, however, would have been simply letting you know where the turns are. Remember, the game having a top-down viewpoint, it's impossible to see more than a few feet ahead of you, as you only get a snapshot of the section of the course you're on. This leads to numerous missed turns, ramp misses, water hazards, etc., even on the tracks you're familiar with. Having that mini-map would have gone a long way to making the game more playable, and stopped a player from having to go and search out cheat codes to just make it to the end. And yes, the game does have codes, apparently. I didn't bother trying any of it. Stepping away from challenge, the game also has a head-to-head mode, which I thought was pretty fun as well. In head-to-head, rather than compete against 3 other computer opponents, you just pick one and have to race that opponent through 24 races. However, head-to-head works a little different than challenge because in head-to-head, you're not simply trying to beat your opponent to the finish line. Head-to-head works more like a tug of war. At the beginning of the race, each player has 4 circles. When you get so far ahead of the other driver that they fall off the screen, you get to take one of their circles. One player has blue, the other has red. And the race resets at that point. The goal is to make all the circles your color. This leads to lots of back and forth action with quick gameplay. No longer are you possibly doomed by one wrong move, you can make a mistake or two, and as long as you make less mistakes than your opponent, you'll win and move on to the next race. Now the races do end in a tiebreaker if you finish the normal 3 laps, but most of the time they'll complete long before that. I get what they were trying to do with challenge mode, and it's probably why it's more the focus of the game due to it more resembling a tournament. I had a lot of fun messing around with head-to-head, and I definitely recommend giving it a look, even if you're just playing in single player and not with a second person. I hadn't mentioned the 2-player mode yet, but it's essentially head-to-head mode, except against a human opponent rather than the computer. You're still attempting the same tug-of-war style race. There's 2 options in 2-player. After each player picks a driver, you can either choose single race mode, where you pick a type of vehicle and go, or you can choose tournament mode, where the computer randomly picks a series of races for both you to compete in. One thing that I thought was nice about the score keeping in 2-player mode, it's a small thing, but being able to have bragging rights on the screen and not having to rely on players' foggy memories just adds to the competition. So I've gone on and on about how the game plays and what it consists of, but I haven't spent a whole lot of time on the graphics or sound, so I should probably mention that now. I mentioned earlier in the intro that the Genesis version of Micro Machines is a port from the NES original, and anyone that sees the NES version of the game and compares it to the Genesis version can definitely see that they're the same game just on different platforms. Coming out in 1991, the NES version looked great in comparison to other games on the system, with a very colorful design and imaginative environments. However, the Genesis version is more or less a straight port from the NES. and it retains its simple graphics. While the Genesis version is certainly cleaned up, it still looks like an 8-bit game. Championship Pro-Am had the same problem. Now, obviously, Micro Machines was still a popular game, even with graphics that weren't up to the same standards as other 1993 releases, so the game itself is less about the graphics and sound and more about the gameplay, but it's something that has to be called out. I don't really have a lot to say about the in-game sound. There's some interesting audio tracks that play during menus and other screens, but I wouldn't call any of that music specifically good. And the remaining in-game audio more or less consists of engine noise and the occasional explosion or bump when you hit an obstacle. Not really a whole lot there, and certainly wasn't a focus for the developers. Overall, I'm giving Micro Machines 3 stars. Licensed video games tend to have lots of problems, as the games are sold based on the license rather than the content of the game. But Micro Machines is also a decent game. While it has some significant flaws, it's still very playable, and there's definite fun to be had here. However, don't be surprised if you're looking up the Infinite Lives code after playing it for a few hours.
Okay, Micro Machines. There's actually 3 more games in this series on for the Genesis, or technically the Mega Drive, as they weren't released in the United States, and a Master System version of this game. And I'll definitely be interested to see how they turned out in comparison to this game, just as soon as I get done importing them from the UK. But rest assured, they are on the schedule to be looked at some point. Tune in next week as we get closer to the end of Season 1, and I take what will probably be the last look at the Genesis before the big year in review video, with an appropriate Christmas-related title, since it's that time of year. However, note that I didn't necessarily say a good Christmas-related title. I've actually never played this one before, so I really don't know how it will go, but I'm keeping expectations low. And maybe, just maybe, we'll have a Christmas miracle on our hands. Remember, whatever you play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.